The plane was taxiing slowly on the runway, ready for takeoff. The hum of the engine was barely perceptible, drowned out by the gentle pressure of a familiar anticipation, that of travelers on the eve of a long-haul flight. Zayden Lambert, an exceptional businessman, was gazing out the window. His dark eyes were fixed on the horizon with the intensity possessed only by those who have learned to navigate the turbulent waters of the business world. It was a rare moment for him, the first time in years he had boarded a commercial flight, his private jet being in maintenance. A slight discomfort washed over him at the thought of mingling with strangers, but he would adapt, just as he had always adapted to obstacles. This flight was merely a stop in an already busy day, but something in this ordinary situation stirred a strange sensation in him. Perhaps it was the memory of the past, when everything had begun with nothing but his iron will. At first glance, Zayden seemed like any other passenger. A stylish man, dressed simply but refined, bearing the mark of those who know that style isn't in extravagance but in subtlety. However, beneath this apparent calm lay a colossal wealth and influence that extended far beyond first-class seats. Zayden had built a revolutionary tech empire from nothing. No family inheritance, no backdoor opened by privileged contacts, but an unparalleled ambition and persistence that never wavered, even in the darkest moments. The businessman whom others now looked at with admiration and respect was none other than a self-made man. The one who had overcome invisible obstacles, often imposed by a society ready to stifle him because of his origins, to rise to the top. As the plane reached cruising speed, Zayden sank into the comfort of his seat, a glass of chilled scotch in his hands. He briefly focused on a new strategic partnership that seemed promising. This deal was crucial, as it would strengthen his grip on an industry that, even dominated by giants, still had gaps to exploit. He didn't immediately notice the flight attendant approaching. It was only a fleeting movement in his field of vision, an insignificant detail to him. But when she positioned herself beside him, he slowly raised his head, as if he had sensed the disturbance. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt, we are about to take off," she said abruptly, her voice sharp, without a hint of softness. He didn't immediately understand what caused the coldness, but a subtle shiver of confusion ran through him. It was as if, in that moment, he had awakened something he shouldn't have. Zayden slowly turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes fell on the badge she wore, Caroline. A common name, like many others. He offered her a polite, subtle smile, the smile of a man accustomed to calming tensions before they erupt. But something in her gaze, a flicker of aggression, sparked an unpleasant feeling in him. When she leaned in closer, his gaze didn't waver, but his features hardened. Caroline grabbed the seatbelt and, without explanation, tightened it violently, as if exerting symbolic pressure, a way of putting him in his place. The metallic sound echoed in the silent cabin air. Zayden, although his seat was already perfectly adjusted, felt a strange disturbance in this mechanically mundane act. A suspended moment was created. She was waiting for a reaction, a protest, an angry gesture. But Zayden remained still, his eyes fixed on her with a cold intensity, his calm unshaken. "Excuse me, you don't need to do that. I can handle my seatbelt myself," he said, his voice calm but firm, measured like a man used to speaking in delicate situations. He expected her to step back, but instead, she stayed there, unyielding. Caroline remained silent for a moment, her gaze unwavering, almost accusatory. Then, in a cold breath, she murmured, "People always think they can talk to us however they want, don't they?" The tone was sharp, an obvious provocation. Zayden straightened slightly, a shiver of irritation running down his spine. Something in her posture, in the way she looked at him, made him uncomfortable. It was as if she expected him to feel guilty, to bend under her authority. Before he had time to respond, in a swift motion, Caroline raised her hand and slapped him violently, the sharp sound reverberating in the cabin. The shock was instantaneous. The air seemed to freeze for a moment, and the surrounding passengers froze, their eyes wide, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Zayden remained still, his hand on his cheek, a bitter taste in his mouth. The blow wasn't physically painful, but the humiliation he felt from the gesture was immediate, brutal. A feeling of contempt he hadn't experienced in years. Another trial in his ascent. He slowly turned his head toward her, his expression remaining impassive, but a cold shiver passed through his eyes. The calm, this tranquility that characterized him, was still there, but behind his pupils, there was something darker, more determined. He stood up, slowly but with obvious authority, imposing himself with his entire stature. The silence in the cabin suddenly grew heavy, the passengers' whispers dying in an instant. Caroline, for her part, didn't flinch, probably believing that her act of violence had been enough to put him in his place. He stood tall, imposing, calm. His movements were measured, as if time belonged to him. Caroline, clearly satisfied with her lesson, shrugged in a haughty manner, her face hardened by the conviction that she had done what was necessary. Yet, she seemed to ignore that Xaden, still in an imposing silence, was letting nothing slip. His gaze swept across the cabin, briefly resting on the flight attendant, then turned to the passengers. No words, no gestures to express his anger. But in his mind, a decision had been made. But Xaden, still calm, looked her straight in the eyes and in a low and determined voice, said, "You made a mistake." Caroline crossed her arms, trying to maintain her authority, but Xaden now towered over her with his full stature. The tension between them was palpable, almost electric. He had that presence that, without a word, commanded respect. Caroline, on the other hand, was desperately trying to hide her nervousness. She had never believed someone could stand up to her like this. She, the controlling, the inflexible, was now destabilized by this man who seemed unafraid to face the storm. Xaden slowly took out his phone, his gaze still locked on her. He tapped a few digits, and the entire room seemed to freeze in anticipation. Then, with a smooth motion, he brought the device to his ear, never taking his eyes off her. The silence weighed heavily, each second stretching out like an eternity. Caroline felt her heart race, a wave of anxiety rising within her. She knew deep down that he had just crossed a line no passenger had ever dared to cross. "Michael, it's Xaden," he said calmly, his voice as cold as steel. "I want this plane to return to the gate immediately. Yes, now. No questions. Do it." Caroline, who had been so confident just moments before, froze upon hearing these words. The reality hit her like a slap. Xaden wasn't just another passenger. He was a force unto himself, and he feared nothing and no one. His gaze became sharper, more intense, and Caroline felt her authority crack under the pressure of this calm yet unyielding man. She tried to protest, her voice trembling, betraying her loss of control, but Xaden cut her off with a cold, unblinking stare. No words, just a heavy silence. He returned his phone to his pocket with a quiet assurance, as though the matter had already been settled, as though what he had just requested was a mere formality. Within seconds, the captain's voice rang out over the intercom, clear and unequivocal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we must return to the gate due to unforeseen circumstances. Please remain seated." The tone was neutral, but Caroline couldn't help but feel that this announcement, far from ordinary, had just disrupted the balance she thought she had mastered. Caroline's face instantly drained of color. She turned toward Xaden, but this time, she no longer confronted him. The words caught in her throat, unable to come out. What are you doing?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. But Xaden did not respond. He simply continued to look at her, his posture straight, his eyes impenetrable. He didn't need to speak to get his message across. He knew that intimidation didn't lie in words, but in the certainty of his actions. Caroline, completely destabilized, felt vulnerable under his iron gaze. She had wanted to humiliate him. He, a mere passenger, with nothing but his presence and his calm. But she had triggered a reaction she had never anticipated. She had underestimated the man she thought she could manipulate, and now she was paying the price. The plane slowly made a U-turn, the engines roaring as it returned to the gate. The passengers, half confused, exchanged incredulous glances, whispering among themselves, but Xaden showed no sign of agitation. For him, this reversal was just a detail, A simple adjustment of trajectory. For Caroline, however, it marked the beginning of her downfall. The power she thought she wielded was dissolving with every passing second. Deep inside, she knew that what was to come wouldn't be easy. Her hands were sweaty, her heart pounding, but Xaden still didn't flinch. He just watched her, his quiet authority and commanding presence crushing her effortlessly. Caroline, trembling, already knew what awaited her. And this time, she could no longer escape the truth she had been ignoring all along. She was no longer the one in control of the situation. A few minutes later, the head of the cabin crew arrived hurriedly, his expression grave, filled with respect. His rapid steps betrayed the pressure of the situation, but he forced himself to maintain a neutral face. "Mr. Lambert, please accept our sincerest apologies," he said in a measured, formal tone, but with clear respect. "We've been informed of the situation." His eyes briefly flicked to Caroline, then locked back on Xaden. "Caroline, you need to disembark immediately." Shock painted itself on Caroline's face. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her authority, her apparent power, was melting before everyone's eyes. "What? No, this is impossible," she protested, her voice trembling with disbelief, but her face crumbled when she met the unyielding gaze of the supervisor. There was no compassion in his eyes, only the cold truth of an order he couldn't refuse. "It's an order, Caroline." The supervisor waited for a moment, as if to give Caroline the illusion of choice. But when she tried to protest again, he insisted firmly. There was no turning back for her now. Caroline hurriedly gathered her belongings, her trembling hands betraying her state of mind. Each movement was a reminder of the brutal fall of her career and status. The passengers, silent witnesses to the public humiliation, stood back, some exchanging puzzled glances, others whispering inaudible words. Caroline, with a dignity that was cracking more with each passing second, walked toward the door, each step heavy with a shame she had never known. Xaden's eyes followed her, expressionless, but in his gaze, there was something more. No triumph, no excessive satisfaction, just a quiet certainty. This scene was just a small victory in a much larger battle. The weight of his gaze accompanied Caroline to the exit, like a reminder of the place everyone was meant to occupy, no matter the situation. Once she was gone, Xaden calmly sat back down, his face serene as though nothing had happened. He didn't need to justify himself, nor attract attention to himself. He simply existed. The murmurs of the passengers were barely perceptible around him, some fascinated, others still in disbelief. Xaden, however, remained calm and unyielding, as if the event had been nothing more than a small disruption on the long road he had chosen. The captain announced that the flight would resume shortly, his voice over the intercom a little softer, almost reassuring. But Xaden, lost in his thoughts, didn't react. The sound of the engines, the familiar hum of the plane, all seemed distant. In his mind, the scene in the airplane was just a reminder of what he had endured to get to this point, to earn respect. He had learned that respect was not given, it was taken, and in that moment, Caroline had fully understood its weight. As he scrolled through his work reports on his phone, his thoughts wandered. No matter how high one climbs in life, there will always be people who try to humiliate you, to put you down, he thought. But Xaden wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't born to submit. With every obstacle, every humiliation, he had grown stronger. And today, that message was clear to all who understood. He would never back down. The plane slowly ascended, the city spread below like a peaceful painting. Xaden finally stood up, heading toward the window. His gaze briefly fixed on the clouds, lost in deep thought. But before he could drift too far into his reflections, a quiet yet sincere voice broke the silence. A businessman in his 50s, serious but respectful, addressed him. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his voice low but filled with recognition. I just wanted to say that you handled that with rare class. It's about time some people understood they can't behave like that." Xaden slowly turned his head, observing the man for a moment, perhaps trying to read his intentions. Then, after a pause, he gave a slight nod. There's always time for some to learn, he replied with cold neutrality, without smiling, but his intense gaze carried the full weight of his words. It wasn't vanity, nor an arrogant statement. It was a simple truth. The businessman seemed to understand the gravity of Zayden's words. He gave a slight bow, as if to acknowledge the wisdom of what had just been said, and fell silent. Zayden turned back to the window. The scene on the plane, the looks of the other passengers, these were all reflections of something larger. What he had just done was not revenge, nor a simple act of justice. It was a message, a declaration of principles. He stood up again and stretched. Yes, it was a message that Caroline, like so many others before her, had learned at her own expense. Zayden knew that his life would always be filled with challenges. But at every step, he imposed himself with unwavering dignity. And today, he had taught a valuable lesson to all those who thought they were above others. Respect is earned, Zayden thought as he gazed at the endless sky through the window. And for him, the lesson had been delivered, not just to Caroline, but to all those who believed that social hierarchy was measured by privileges or appearances. For him, respect was a matter of character, and he had far more to offer than most.